Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to take a slow, spine-tingling walk through a place you have probably only seen in the darkest corners of a museum or in the shadowy scenes of a late-night documentary. Imagine, for a moment, the faint scrape of iron chains against damp stone, the way torchlight flickers over ancient soot-stained walls, and the peculiar smell that lingers, a complicated blend of cold metal, old sweat, and the hint of something you can't quite place but your imagination kindly fills in the gaps. You step inside, and the thick wooden door creaks shut behind you. Maybe it's just your nerves, but you're suddenly aware of every sound, the drip of water somewhere out of sight, the muted shuffle of straw underfoot, the echo of your own uncertain breath. If you're picturing something grim, you're not wrong. But tonight we're going to take it slow, keep things gentle, and see what lessons, and a few surprises, history's most notorious torture chambers can teach us about discomfort, creativity, and why you'd probably last about 5 minutes in here if that. Before we go any further, a word of playful warning. This chamber isn't just for the faint of heart. There will be stories you won't soon forget, odd facts that'll have you raising your eyebrows in the dark, and the kind of details that make you wonder if anyone in the past ever slept soundly. By the end, you might even feel a bit grateful for your soft bed and the distinct lack of chains hanging from the ceiling. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And, as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I genuinely love seeing how many brave souls join us from all over the world. Now, turn off the lights. Maybe turn on the fan for some soft noise, and let's get started tonight. You step forward, blinking to adjust to the shifting light, and realize the chamber is far from empty. It's a bizarre, almost theatrical display of medieval hardware chains of every length. Heavy wooden stocks with smoothed edges from years of use, rusty iron cuffs suspended from the ceiling, and a few things you wouldn't recognize even after a solid hour on Wikipedia. In one corner sits a chair bristling with spikes, its purpose both obvious and, thankfully, not demonstrated. The air is colder here, sinking into your bones with every hesitant step. But before you start imagining every grotesque scenario, remember this. Not everything in a torture chamber was about physical pain. Sometimes the mere suggestion, the shadow on the wall, the slow rattle of keys, or the whispered stories was enough to make confessions spill out faster than you can say, "I promise I won't steal any more apples." In medieval times, fear was half the tool set, and everyone in town knew exactly what went on in the dim recesses beneath the castle or city hall. You'd think people would avoid these places, but history is full of the curious and the morbid. Crowds would gather for public punishments, not always to jeer, sometimes just to see what the fuss was about, or maybe to sneak a glance at a device they'd only heard about in whispers. Of course, not all chambers were created equal. Some were grand, with carved stone benches for the local magistrate and ominous racks set under stained glass. Others were just damp basements, hastily repurposed when the village decided it needed to get serious about crime. But they all had one thing in common: the ability to make even the bravest soul reconsider every mildly questionable decision they'd ever made. It's also worth mentioning that on rare occasions these gloomy rooms doubled as storage spaces for the more mundane clutter of daily life old tools, barrels of suspiciously unlabeled liquids, even the occasional sack of onions waiting for market day. If the executioner's apprentice was having a good day, he might let a chicken wander through just to keep the rats guessing. Now, for a little historical context, medieval Europe, especially from the 12th century onward, was a place obsessed with order, confession, and sometimes creative punishments. Torture wasn't always the first option. In fact, the formal legal use of torture in Europe was usually reserved for serious crimes, heresy, treason, witchcraft, or anything that kept the authorities awake at night. Most minor criminals, petty thieves, rowdy drunks, or the guy who borrowed a neighbor's pig for a little too long were more likely to face the stocks, a fine, or for some reason being forced to publicly apologize while wearing a chicken-shaped hat. Still, the reputation of torture chambers grew. Much of it was by design. The rumor of a place, the mere mention that someone went down into the cellars and came back a changed person, was often enough to keep the rest of the village in line. No medieval chamber of horrors was complete without its own urban legends, each more exaggerated than the last, each retold by candlelight on stormy nights. There's even a record from the 14th century of a lord so terrified of his own dungeons that he insisted on sleeping in a bell tower, convinced the ghosts of the wrongly accused would come looking for him. And here's a strange but true footnote. Sometimes, when not used for its grim purpose, the local torture chamber became the safest place in town during a siege. Thick walls, no windows, and only one entrance, practically a medieval panic room, if you could overlook the decor. There are a handful of stories about villagers huddled in these grim chambers, telling jokes to pass the time, trying not to think too hard about the odd stains on the floor. Of course, it wasn't all horror. Like everything in medieval life, there was an odd, everyday rhythm to even the darkest corners. The man who oiled the rack also sharpened tools for the kitchen. The town scribe, whose job it was to note every confession, sometimes filled the margins of his grim records with surprisingly whimsical doodles, frogs, cats, and once a suspiciously accurate drawing of what looks like a medieval bread roll with a face. Even in a torture chamber, boredom and humor found a way to sneak in. So tonight, as you settle in, remember this isn't just a tour of cruelty. It's a look at how people lived with fear, with rumor, with the unexpected, and with the ever-present urge to leave a doodle somewhere even in the darkest of places. History's torture chambers were as much about controlling stories as controlling bodies, and sometimes the stories were stranger than anything that actually happened within these walls. You shuffle a little deeper into the gloom, the cold from the stone floor now creeping through your shoes. At first, your eyes fix on the big, intimidating stuff. The racks, the spiked chairs, the iron cages dangling in the shadows. But then you notice something far more common, almost mundane, rows and rows of chain shackles and wooden cuffs mounted along the walls, like the world's most threatening tool shed. For many accused souls, these humble devices were the opening act in the medieval theater of justice. You try not to imagine how many wrists or ankles have passed through those iron loops over the years. The metal looks worn not from any attempt at comfort, but from centuries of nervous, sweaty hands and the clumsy efficiency of jailers going about their business. Restraint devices, stocks, manacles, and the like weren't just for the worst criminals. In towns large and small, a set of stocks was about as common as a church bell. If you've ever seen the classic painting of a busy village square, you might have noticed that the stocks are rarely empty. There's always some unfortunate soul wedged in there, a petty thief, a market cheat, someone who drank a bit too much and sang bawdy songs in front of the mayor's house. It was all very public and often oddly festive. People would wander by, toss a rotten turnip or two, and occasionally pose for what passed as medieval selfies, usually someone's cousin sketching the scene with charcoal on a scrap of parchment. But while stocks were usually reserved for the less serious offenders, the more heavy-duty equipment in the chamber was strictly business. Manacles, iron cuffs that could be chained to the wall. The floor or each other were adjustable for wrists, ankles, and in the case of especially unlucky visitors' necks. Imagine having to hold a position for hours or even days, limbs stretched just far enough to be deeply uncomfortable, but not quite enough to leave lasting damage. The genius of medieval restraint devices was that they made even waiting around a form of punishment. No need for screaming, just boredom, muscle cramps, and a slow-burning sense of doom. Here's a historical tidbit: restraint was so central to the concept of justice that some towns would compete over whose stocks or pillories were most ornate. In Norwich, England, there was a set of stocks with hand-carved faces and a tiny roof, so at least your humiliation was protected from the rain. In France, one town installed a revolving set of stocks just to keep things interesting and ensure everyone got a good view. Talk about crowd engagement. It wasn't all stone-faced severity, though. Medieval punishments often blurred the line between justice and public entertainment. On festival days, the stocks might be decorated with ribbons, and the unlucky occupant would find themselves the subject of jokes, songs, and even the occasional marriage proposal. It's unclear how many of those were serious, but history suggests the answer is not many. Children would dare each other to sneak up and paint the faces of the punished with soot or flour, a sort of medieval precursor to viral pranks. But back to the less festive side. While stocks and manacles could be uncomfortable, their real purpose was psychological. They announced to everyone that the person inside was at the mercy of the community. The shame was public, the discomfort real, and the lesson unforgettable, at least until the next poor soul landed in the same spot. If you think about it, the average villager probably spent more time worrying about ending up in the stocks than they did about anything that might happen in a dimly lit torture chamber. After all, the pain of a twisted ankle might fade, but the memory of your neighbor cackling at your expense could haunt you for years. Of course, the big scary stuff was always looming in the background, and the presence of all these restraint devices helped set the stage. The mere fact that you could see them lined up ready waiting was enough to put most people in a cooperative mood. There's even a record of a merchant who confessed to overcharging for salted fish, after a single glance at the wall of cuffs and a particularly stern look from the town bailiff. If you were truly unlucky, your stay in the chamber might include the collar of shame, a wide iron band that would chafe your neck and announce your crime to everyone in town. Some collars had little bells attached, so you couldn't even sneak to the privy without drawing a crowd. Medieval humor had its own brand of cruelty. On the lighter side, here's a truly bizarre detail in some places. After your time in the stocks was up, it was customary for the local baker to give you a free loaf of bread. Supposedly, this was to restore your dignity. Historians are still divided on whether this was an act of kindness, a practical joke, or simply a clever way to keep the town's flour supply moving. So as you look around at the chains and cuffs, remember that they weren't just tools of torment, they were props in an elaborate social ritual. Every village had its own quirks and traditions, and sometimes the difference between pain and punishment was just a matter of how many people stopped to watch. In the end, these devices tell us less about medieval cruelty and more about a world where public opinion was every bit as important as the law itself. You edge past the rows of restraints, and suddenly your gaze lands on something both infamous and enigmatic: the Iron Maiden. Its doors stand slightly ajar like the world's least inviting wardrobe, dark spikes glinting just enough to make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval cruelty. If you've ever wondered how much of the legend is fact and how much is fiction, you're in good company. Historians have argued for centuries about whether anyone was actually locked inside or whether the Iron Maiden was simply a marketing ploy. dreamed up by overzealous museum curators centuries later. The Iron Maiden, as you see it now, is a tall, coffin-like structure forged of thick iron plates, with a face hammered into its surface and hinged doors studded with wicked spikes. The story goes that a hapless victim would be placed inside the doors shut, and the spikes would pierce but not kill instantly, ensuring a slow, agonizing end. Or so the legend says. The reality. There's scant evidence of the device ever being used during the Middle Ages. Most authentic Iron Maidens on display in European museums were actually cobbled together in the 18th and 19th centuries, when sensational stories and a growing tourism market made torture seem like a profitable sideshow. Still, the mere presence of the Iron Maiden in a chamber like this is enough to send a chill down your spine. You can imagine the whispered warnings, "Behave," or you'll meet the maiden mothers would say to children who refused to eat their vegetables. Some scholars suspect the device's reputation outpaced its actual use, fueled by travelers' tales, and the human tendency to invent monsters where none exist. And yet, even in the absence of hard evidence, the Iron Maiden remains a powerful symbol. It's a reminder that sometimes what people believe about a place can be more terrifying than what really happened there. In the same way that modern horror movies keep us checking under the bed, the Maiden's sinister silhouette kept generations awake at night wondering what horrors lurked just out of sight. While you're pondering the Maiden's legacy, here's a curious historical tangent. Did you know the medieval period also gave birth to one of the world's first toothbrushes? It's true. Monks and aristocrats alike sometimes chewed on frayed twigs or used brushes made from boar bristles set in bone or wood. Dental hygiene, it turns out, was a surprisingly high priority, at least for those who could afford it. Of course, if you were unlucky enough to be hauled before the local magistrate, clean teeth probably weren't your top concern. Back in the chamber, you notice that the Iron Maiden sits on a raised dais slightly apart from the other implements. Whether or not it ever saw use its function now is clear. It's a stage prop designed to impress, intimidate, and inspire stories. A clever jailer could accomplish a lot just by dragging a prisoner past its open doors. No demonstration required imagination did all the work. And what about the bizarre, unrelated events that always seem to crop up in historical accounts of these chambers? One famous record tells of a town council who, when short on funds, converted their chamber into a house of curiosities on market days. For a small fee, villagers could tour the room, gawk at the Maiden and other devices, and even leave with a souvenir, a sketch of their own horrified face, drawn by the scribe who doubled as the local artist. The chamber became a place of gossip and spectacle, as much as punishment, proving that humans have always had a knack for turning even the darkest corners of life into opportunities for entertainment. Looking closer at the Iron Maiden, you spot faded initials scratched into its side. Maybe it was the work of a bored guard, or perhaps a condemned soul hoping to leave a final secret mark. Either way, the device stands as a testament to the blurred boundaries between fact and fiction, pain and performance memory and myth. And speaking of blurred lines, it's worth noting that medieval towns were often far more pragmatic than their fearsome reputation suggests. When tools of punishment weren't in use, they were sometimes loaned out to neighboring villages, or repurposed for other jobs. An Iron Maiden makes a decent grain bin in a pinch, though no one would admit to storing the harvest next to a device infamous for storing people. Even the spikes, historians note, were sometimes borrowed to patch up wagons or repair fences, a fact that somewhat takes the sting out of their legend. So, as you linger by the Iron Maiden, remember that its most potent weapon was the imagination. It loomed in the background of village stories, haunted the dreams of troublemakers, and inspired artists and pranksters alike. Whether or not anyone ever truly met their fate behind its doors, its power lay in the fear it inspired, and the tales that grew taller with every retelling. Now that you've survived the icy glare of the Iron Maiden, and maybe even checked your wrists for stray splinters, your attention slides to the longest, most menacing object in the room. A hefty wooden frame, complete with thick rollers, sturdy ropes, and iron pulleys. You may have heard it whispered about in medieval lore, the rack. If the Iron Maiden was all about psychological terror, the rack took a far more, shall we say, direct approach. Its design was brutally simple and terrifyingly effective. The accused would be bound by the wrists and ankles stretched out on the frame like laundry in a stiff wind, and the rollers would slowly turn, pulling the victim's limbs in opposite directions with methodical, unhurried precision. But let's pause before we conjure any nightmares. Contrary to popular myth, most uses of the rack weren't about dismemberment or cinematic gore. It was about threat exhaustion and the subtle art of making people say what you wanted them to say. The purpose was to loosen tongues, not limbs. Medieval justice was obsessed with confession, and the rack was the favored tool for encouraging a little extra honesty, though the authorities always claimed they preferred voluntary admissions, of course. The earliest confirmed uses of the rack go back to the 13th and 14th centuries, becoming especially popular in England and across the continent for suspected traitors' spies and those accused of heresy. What's strange is how its operation quickly became a kind of grim routine. The jailer would tighten the ropes, pause, wait for a confession, then maybe tighten a little more if the answers weren't satisfactory. Sometimes they'd break for bread and cheese after all. Even executioners had to eat and then return for another round. You can imagine the small talk, lovely weather for stretching, isn't it, Jeffrey? The psychological gamesmanship didn't end there. Sometimes just being shown the rack was enough to make even the most stubborn suspect reconsider. It was a tool for spectacle as much as suffering, with town officials and curious onlookers often invited to witness the drama. There's a record from Spain of an accused heretic who fainted dead away at the mere sight of the rack, an outcome that probably saved him a great deal of trouble, though it likely didn't do much for his reputation as a tough guy. And here's where things get unexpectedly odd during periods of peace. When there weren't enough criminals to keep the rack busy, it was occasionally borrowed by the local nobility for therapeutic stretching exercises. Medieval medicine often recommended a good stretch for back pain, and there are scattered accounts of knights using the rack with gentler handling. One hopes to help recover from riding injuries. You have to admire the resourcefulness. Why let a perfectly good torture device sit idle when you can use it as a medieval Pilates machine? Meanwhile, in another corner of the same chamber, the town's more limber citizens found ways to keep themselves in shape with their own improvised routines. Monks developed stretches not unlike modern yoga, blending prayer breathwork and long, slow movements to soothe the body and possibly avoid ending up on the wrong side of the law. It turns out that a flexible back was good for both piety and plausible deniability. Amidst all the stretching, intentional or otherwise, there was always the odd moment of humor. One chronicler describes an unfortunate town magistrate who, during a demonstration for visiting dignitaries, accidentally locked himself into the rack and had to be rescued by a giggling kitchen maid. His dignity, much like his posture, was never quite the same. But let's not forget the main event confessions. The rack's real legacy was in the stories it produced. Tales of miraculous endurance, of unlikely bargains struck under pressure, and of people swearing to anything just to be let off the ropes. Medieval towns thrived on these stories. They traveled fast and mutated quickly. Soon, the rack was blamed for everything from a bad harvest to a missing pig, because after all, if it could extract confessions, surely it could extract curses too. Of course not. Every confession led to a conviction. Medieval courts, for all their fearsome reputation, were often more interested in spectacle than in justice. There are numerous cases where suspects were released after confessing to all manner of crimes only to be seen a week later, buying apples at the market and cheerfully retelling their own ordeal for a free pint of ale. If all this sounds bizarre, consider the rack's lasting place in the popular imagination. Even centuries later, it's the centerpiece of every haunted dungeon, and the star of every spooky tour guide's monologue. Imagine being stretched, they'll say in voices hushed for dramatic effect until you're taller than the town priest. Not that anyone ever checked, but it does make for a memorable story, and in the oddest twist of all, one particularly inventive nobleman in France adapted a retired rack into a drying rack for his laundry. Local legend insists his shirts were never wrinkled again, though his guests were understandably reluctant to ask about the stains. So next time you stretch after a long day, spare a thought for the original experts. And remember that in the medieval torture chamber, the line between pain and performance horror and hilarity was always thinner than you'd expect. You might think that the scariest part of a medieval torture chamber was the hardware iron spikes, thick manacles, the heavy rack creaking ominously. But sometimes the real torture began before a single finger was laid on the accused. Welcome to the twisted art of confession, where fear rumor and performance blurred the line between truth and survival. In the candlelit gloom, the act of wringing confessions became a performance for both prisoner and interrogator equal parts, psychological chess match and awkward medieval improv night. Imagine yourself seated on a cold bench, your heart thumping, surrounded by officials with quills poised and faces set in stone. The magistrate's voice echoes in the chamber, reading out accusations both plausible and occasionally so absurd you'd swear you'd wandered into a street theater. Admit you spoke with the devil and charmed the village hens into laying square eggs. Yes, that's an actual accusation from a 15th century court record. It didn't matter if you were guilty or not. What mattered was how convincing your denial and how much patience you had for their parade of increasingly odd questions. Historically, confessions were prized above all else. Torture was considered the last resort, but the mere threat could make knees buckle. The church and state both believed that no one could withstand pain without blurting out the truth. If you confessed voluntarily, it was easier for everyone. The court could close the case, the public got a show, and, you'd probably escape the worst of the chamber's tools, but not always. Even a confession could be met with punishment just to be sure. But things didn't always go as planned. Some prisoners recited long-rehearsed speeches filled with saints' names and legal technicalities, hoping to bore the interrogators into giving up. Others tried creative flattery, complimenting the magistrate's beard or the scribe's calligraphy in hopes that a little charm might buy some mercy. And sometimes, in moments that live forever in footnotes, the tables were turned. There are stories of jesters called in to lighten the mood, and accidentally derailing the entire process with a well-timed joke or an insult so clever even the judge couldn't keep a straight face. Public confessions were often staged for maximum effect. Townsfolk would be summoned to listen, the accused would be paraded in, and the entire drama would play out like a morality play, part cautionary tale and part soap opera. For the audience, it was better than the local market and twice as memorable. Occasionally, if a confession was especially entertaining, someone would compose a ballad about it. Thus was born the confession song, a strange genre that flourished in a few European towns, some of which survive today as nursery rhymes with remarkably grim origins. But not all confessions were forced. Some were bargains. Confess, and we'll spare your family. Name names, and you'll only spend a night in the stocks. This barter system created a tangled web of half-truths and rumors, each confession leading to a fresh round of accusations. Medieval towns could become a paranoid maze with neighbors whispering and scribes scribbling as fast as they could. While the system was cruel, it was also deeply inefficient. In one famous case, a scribe misheard a confession about stealing geese and recorded it as summoning ghosts. The accused protested, but the magistrate, more interested in a dramatic tale than a mundane theft, insisted the ghost story stand. Thus, a new town legend was born, and the local priest spent the next year giving sermons on the dangers of spiritual poultry. But the need for drama had its lighter moments too. During slow seasons, a court might stage a mock confession complete with costumes, bad wigs, and all the hammy acting a sleepy village could muster. These theatrical displays were part deterrent, part entertainment, and sometimes served as a training exercise for the younger generation of magistrates and aspiring actors. And not every confession ended with punishment. Sometimes the prisoner's story was so fantastic or convoluted that the judges, unable to make sense of it, simply threw up their hands and let the accused go home. In one documented instance, a man confessed to turning himself invisible to steal honey from the Lord's kitchen. The judge, after a long pause, replied, "I'd rather see it than hear it," and sent him on his way with a loaf of bread and a stern warning to leave the bees alone. Of course, there were still risks. Even the cleverest confession couldn't always save you from the odd punishments that followed. One town had a tradition where anyone who confessed to gossiping about the mayor's hat had to spend a day wearing a hat twice its size adorned with turnips and painted feathers, while the village children marched behind singing songs about honest heads and foolish hats. And through it all, the chamber echoed with the scribble of quills, the nervous coughs of magistrates, and the quiet hum of stories weaving themselves into the fabric of the town. The art of confession was messy, creative, and rarely fair, but it left behind some of the strangest, most human moments in the history of medieval justice. If you were accused of something truly scandalous, witchcraft heresy, or just having an uncanny talent for baking suspiciously good bread, there was always a chance you'd meet one of the chamber's most peculiar tests: the dunking stool, or the so-called trial by water. Of all the tools in the medieval arsenal, this one may be the most theatrical. In the shadowy half-light of the chamber, a heavy wooden chair, sometimes built on long arms like a seesaw, waits by a cold stone pit, or, if the village was lucky, by the edge of a river. It's hard not to wonder who first looked at a perfectly innocent chair and thought, this would be so much better if we dipped it repeatedly into water with someone tied to it. The logic behind the dunking stool, or its cousin the ordeal by water, is as circular as it is bizarre. The basic premise: tie the accused to a chair, dunk them in water, and see what happens. Float, and you're guilty likely because the water rejects you. Sink, and you're innocent, though you may need rescuing, preferably before the town blacksmith's lunch break. It's a lose-lose situation, a kind of early medieval life hack for never running out of gossip or court cases. This wasn't just for witches. Any crime that smacked of magic trickery or female cunning could land someone on the stool. There are records of bakers, midwives, fortune-tellers, and even a few unlucky poets enduring this soggy test of character. While the crowd gathered to watch eager for a bit of excitement, the scribe was busy inventing colorful phrases like a most drippy defendant or a floating fibber. Beyond the dunking, there were even stranger ordeals. Trial by hot iron, for example, involved carrying a burning bar for several paces. If your wounds healed cleanly, you were innocent, or perhaps just lucky enough to have a sympathetic priest tending the bandages. Ordeal by bread and cheese required the accused to eat a hunk of both without choking. In one village, a local blacksmith was acquitted when he managed to swallow a mouthful of dusty rye and hard goat cheese with a straight face, though he never quite regained his taste for snacks. Oddly, these ordeals were not just about finding the truth. They were spectacles, part of the town's rhythm, blending religious ritual, local superstition, and good old-fashioned entertainment. The test was as much for the community as the accused. Priests sprinkled holy water, onlookers muttered prayers or bets, and the accused braced for either a cold dip or a trip to the healer. In some towns, a successful ordeal became a point of pride. Families would retell the story for generations, sometimes embellishing it, until Great-Aunt Agnes could apparently outswim a duck while singing hymns. Of course not every ordeal was fatal or humiliating. Sometimes they served as a form of penance. In Italy, records show villagers volunteering for a gentle dunking as a way to make peace with a neighbor or erase the memory of a particularly disastrous harvest festival. The crowd would cheer, someone would pass around sweet buns, and the priest would remind everyone that forgiveness, like cold water, stings, but eventually passes. And there's always that element of the bizarre in a small German town. A judge once ordered a rooster to undergo trial by water after being accused of laying an egg, a clear case of unnatural acts. The rooster survived presumably with his reputation and feathers intact, though he became something of a local celebrity. Let's not forget the fashion side of things. The accused were often dressed in their most embarrassing clothes, borrowed nightshirts, old hats, or if the town jester had a hand in things, an oversized bonnet with dangling carrots. The reasoning: if you had to suffer, you might as well look ridiculous doing it. Children especially loved these scenes, turning the ordeal into a kind of slapstick theater that would later be immortalized in drawings, stories, and, in at least one case, a remarkably catchy folk tune. But even the most theatrical ordeal could take a strange turn. Some towns began to use their dunking stools for more peaceful purposes. Baptisms, local fairs, or even fishing competitions, first to catch a pike without falling in, wins a jug of ale. These odd civic traditions show just how adaptable even the harshest tools of justice could become in the hands of a creative community. So, the next time you see a simple wooden chair by the riverbank, think twice before sitting down. In the medieval world, you never knew when justice superstition or just plain boredom would require you to prove your innocence with a splash. And, in the end, the lesson was always the same. Never underestimate the power of water laughter and a community in need of a good story. In the colder, darker reaches of the chamber, your eye is drawn to the dancing shadows that flicker from a row of blackened iron braziers and piles of firewood. The smell is unmistakable charred wood and hot metal, a scent that clings to stone and skin alike. Tonight's subject, the medieval fascination with fire and the peculiar blend of fear spectacle and almost superstitious logic that surrounded burning branding and the constant threat of being a little too close to the coals. Fire, of course, was more than a tool of punishment. In a world without electricity, it was comfort protection, and if you happened to be a baker, a professional hazard. But in the hands of medieval authorities, fire took on new meaning. Burning at the stake became the ultimate symbol of the power wielded by church and state. Even lesser forms of fire-based punishment, branding scorching, or making the accused stand barefoot on heated metal, were designed less for pain and more for drama. If the goal was to leave a mark, both literal and psychological, nothing said, "Don't mess with the rules," quite like a red-hot iron. You can picture the scene: a crowded square, villagers pressed close, the condemned trembling on a platform as a priest recited solemn warnings. There is an eerie hush, punctuated only by the pop and hiss of burning logs. Branding irons carefully shaped to display the town's insignia, or sometimes just a plain old T for thief, glowed in the embers, waiting for their brief moment of fame. Some towns preferred a more elaborate show: heating chains or iron collars to sear their message across the skin. There are records from France and Italy where whole festivals were built around these events, turning the grim act of punishment into something resembling a firelit carnival: food vendors hawking pies, musicians squeezing out wobbly tunes, and children playing tag in the glow of justice being served. But for all the drama, there was an oddly practical side to it as well. Branding, while painful, at least meant you'd survived, unlike burning at the stake, which tended to leave you with a rather short postscript. Many branded criminals returned to daily life with their new scar, as both warning and passport. In some regions, a marked hand or cheek meant you couldn't be tried again for the same crime. Repeat offenders, though, risked running out of unbranded skin, which led to one English judge wryly noting that there are but so many cheeks and fingers upon a man. Of course, not everyone took fire-based punishment so seriously. Medieval kitchens were notorious rumor mills, and the boundary between justice and everyday life was thin as parchment. Picture a baker caught pilfering grain who emerges from the chamber with a singed ear and instantly becomes the subject of jokes and songs as he returns to stoking the communal oven. In one German village, a notorious cheese thief inspired a local tradition. Any baker caught burning a loaf had to wear it as a hat during the next market day. There are even stories of cooks and blacksmiths using the punishment brazier as an impromptu grill after hours producing the world's first justice sausages. The line between solemnity and silliness was never clear. Meanwhile, fire had deep roots in the medieval psyche. Religious rituals often included the lighting of candles to ward off evil, and legends abounded of saints who emerged from flames unharmed. The same society that believed in the purifying power of fire also feared its capricious side. A spark could mean warmth or ruin. No wonder the authorities found it such an effective tool for keeping people in line. Not all fiery punishments involved the body. The mere threat of being sent to the coals could get people talking. Chroniclers describe town criers who would march through the streets shouting out the next branding or burning, and somehow manage to make even the innocent shiver. In fact, medieval courts often used fire as a symbol. Documents sealed with red wax that was melted over a flame signified a judgment as final as the brand on a criminal's skin. And then there's the oddball story you can't help but love: a medieval kitchen that doubled as the punishment chamber for minor culinary crimes. One cook, having burned the Lord's dinner for the third time in a week, was sentenced to serve the next meal dressed as a roast chicken, complete with feathered hat and ladle scepter. The punishment was less about pain and more about pride, and the echoes of laughter lingered long after the embers faded. In the end, fire in the torture chamber was a double-edged sword. It threatened and protected, punished and amused, marked the body, and shaped the memory. It brought people together, even as it pushed some to the edge. And above all, it left a trail of stories, half warning, half entertainment for generations to pass along by candlelight. Beyond the braziers and branding irons tucked almost out of sight is a device so strange and so steeped in rumor that it sounds like something from a twisted fairy tale, the infamous pear of anguish. Its very name is enough to make you pause. Set on a dusty shelf or hanging from a hook, the pear is a small metallic contraption, shaped like the fruit for which it's named, with petal-like segments that expand by twisting a screw at its base. Its alleged purpose: to be inserted, depending on the nature of your crime, into the mouth, or sometimes other places best left unnamed in polite company. Then, with a few turns, the petals would open, causing pain, humiliation, and the occasional medical emergency. Or so the stories go. Here's the twist. Historians are still debating whether the pear of anguish was actually used for torture at all, or if it was a later invention made to shock the imaginations of museum goers and thrill-seekers centuries after the medieval period. The device itself exists. Several can be found on display in collections across Europe, but concrete evidence of its use is elusive. Many suspect the pear, like the Iron Maiden, may be less a relic of historical cruelty and more a product of humanity's inexhaustible appetite for dark stories. Regardless of its origins, the pear of anguish found its way into folklore. Townsfolk whispered about it after dark, inventing ever more elaborate tales. In some places, children were threatened with the pear if they misbehaved, much like the bogeyman, or being sent to bed without supper. The mere idea of the device was enough to keep some people in line, proving once again that the most effective tools of fear are often the ones never used. While the pear sat at the intersection of legend and reality, it also became entangled with local superstitions and strange customs. For example, in a certain Flemish village, it was tradition for newlyweds to eat a poached pear on their wedding night, as a sign of fertility and future happiness, a tradition that took on a rather different flavor if you happen to know about the chamber's darker artifact. The poor scribe assigned to document such traditions surely had the world's most eclectic notebook. The line between horror and humor was thin in medieval Europe. There are stories of the pear being used in elaborate pranks, especially during the riotous festivals that erupted before Lent or after a good harvest. One tale from southern France tells of a prankster who crafted a pear out of pastry and presented it to the village priest, causing a round of shocked laughter and presumably a few nervous glances toward the chamber's real collection of oddities. But superstition wasn't limited to the pear alone. Local healers accused of misusing herbs or muttering suspicious prayers often found themselves at the center of stories involving forbidden fruit. One particularly bizarre case involved a healer who was acquitted of witchcraft after successfully curing the mayor's gout with a poultice made from boiled pears and wild honey. The mayor, forever grateful, declared a village holiday, an odd fusion of relief and culinary delight that outlasted the original scandal by centuries. The pear's legend even reached beyond punishment into the realm of ritual. In some parts of Eastern Europe, a pear of blessing was passed among villagers during spring festivals to ensure a bountiful harvest. The irony was lost on no one, especially not the local blacksmith, who often doubled as the chamber's caretaker, and found himself fielding questions about which pear to use for blessings and which for cursing. And then there's the human need to laugh in the face of fear. When the pear was shown off to visitors, the town's children would dare each other to touch it, sometimes slipping a boiled sweet inside, and daring the apprentice scribe to retrieve it with his eyes closed. These moments of childish bravery or foolishness, depending on your perspective, are immortalized in the scribbled margins of old town ledgers, right next to records of livestock taxes and inexplicably detailed lists of lost socks. One of the strangest events tied to the pair involves a medieval feast gone awry. The town jester, notorious for his love of practical jokes, managed to sneak the device onto the high table disguised as a centerpiece. The resulting uproar was so spectacular that it made the local chronicle sandwiched between entries about a failed grain harvest and a record-setting eel catch. Ultimately, the pair of anguish represents everything odd and unpredictable about medieval justice. Was it used? Perhaps. Was it feared? Absolutely. Was it on occasion the subject of a village prank or the centerpiece of a particularly memorable meal? Undoubtedly. The line between horror and hilarity was always thin, and sometimes it took the shape of a fruit. As you venture further into the chamber, a new kind of discomfort begins to gnaw at you, one that isn't physical at all. It's the soundscape. The medieval torture chamber, despite its thick walls and secretive atmosphere, was never truly silent. Imagine the clang of metal against stone, the low murmur of nervous whispers, the echo of footsteps on flagstones. Yet above it all, the most haunting element was the soundtrack of agony, real or imagined. The mind has a curious way of filling the gaps, and even the faintest cry could ripple through the corridors, amplified by anxiety and memory. The fear of hearing screams was so deeply woven into medieval culture that many towns had rules about acceptable hours for loud interrogations. Chroniclers mention that certain hours of the day were reserved for official questioning, supposedly to limit the disturbance to nearby homes, but perhaps just as much to keep the jailers from losing their own nerve. In the evenings, the chamber would quiet, but the rumors did not. As darkness fell, stories grew in volume, stories of shrieking spirits, of howls that signaled confession, and occasionally of unearthly silence that was even more unsettling than noise. Yet it wasn't just the screams that created the chamber's atmosphere. Music played its own subtle role. Medieval musicians, yes, sometimes even in torture chambers, were brought in to drown out the cries, or to signal to crowds that an event was beginning or ending. The distant notes of a lute, a drum, or the mournful drone of bagpipes drifting through the cracks of the castle might seem like a strange counterpoint, but it's true. There are records from London and Prague where an entire processional band would parade by the jail, both to distract the accused and to entertain a curious public that had gathered for what was, after all, a kind of spectacle. One bizarre fact: in a certain Bohemian town, the town crier was paid extra for his ability to yodel convincingly. The logic was that a dramatic yodel would cover any unfortunate sounds from below, while also keeping the mood light for the onlookers above. As you might imagine, this job perk became the subject of both envy and mockery. "If you can't stand the screams, just learn to yodel" became the catchphrase of local pranksters. Still, the echoes of suffering left an imprint not only on those who heard them, but on the space itself. Medieval architecture often amplified sound, creating an environment where a single shout could travel from the deepest dungeons to the kitchen above. There are even tales of cooks timing their bread baking to the muffled wails below. The buns are done when the third confession echoes up the stairs. If you think this sounds like gallows humor, you'd be right. The darker the atmosphere, the sharper the jokes. But not all sounds in the chamber were chilling. There were moments of accidental levity, the clatter of dropped keys, the nervous laughter of a rookie jailer trying to look brave, the flatulent squeak of someone shifting in the stocks, an event often immortalized by the town's scribes in the margins, much to the accused's chagrin. Sometimes music and mayhem collided. During festivals, prisoners would join in with the crowd's songs, adding impromptu lyrics about their predicament. And even the sternest magistrate was known to crack a smile at a particularly clever rhyme. As you take all this in, it's clear that sound wasn't just background noise. It shaped the experience, turning the chamber from a simple room of stone and iron into a stage where fear, hope, and defiance played their parts. The acoustics made every event more dramatic. Each confession, each outburst, each lull in the chaos weaving itself into the fabric of daily life. The walls themselves seemed to remember holding on to stories and secrets, echoing them back on quiet nights. And then there are the unexpected connections to daily medieval life. In one English village, the chamber was situated right below the choir room, so on Sunday mornings the accused might listen to hymns and sermons drifting down from above, a surreal and oddly comforting soundtrack to their ordeal. Some prisoners claimed the music inspired them to confess. Others said it simply made them homesick for the world outside. There's even a record of a cat famously named Sir Meowsalot in the town ledgers, whose persistent yowling from the rafters was blamed for several false confessions. The magistrate, perhaps in a rare moment of mercy, finally had the cat adopted by the village baker, thus ending its unintentional reign of terror. In the end, the medieval chamber's soundtrack was as complicated as its reputation, a jumble of fear, performance improvisation, and the simple, universal need for distraction. Whether it was a scream a song, or the accidental yodel of a desperate crier, every sound left a mark and sometimes a story to pass down through generations. If you step back from the close, echoing darkness of the chamber and peer through a narrow-slit window, you'll see the true stage where pain, justice, and entertainment merged the public square on execution day. The medieval world had a complicated relationship with public punishment, and nowhere was that more evident than when the whole town gathered to watch a hanging, a branding, or, on especially festive occasions, a beheading with all the trimmings. This wasn't just about justice. It was a social event, a market day, a kind of grim block party where food vendors and musicians jockeyed for the best spots and jugglers vied with preachers to capture the crowd's attention. The spectacle of public execution was supposed to be a deterrent, a lesson to the masses. But human nature being what it is, it quickly became something far more lively. Children were known to imitate the town crier, barking out mock sentences with wild hand gestures. Local bakers planned special punishment pastries shaped like gallows or axes and hawked them from baskets. The best viewing spots were often reserved for merchants who used the captive audience to showcase new wares, from winter cloaks to miracle cures for everything from baldness to bad luck. It was not uncommon for the condemned to deliver a speech, some contrite, some defiant, and some surprisingly witty. Chroniclers tell of a pickpocket in York who, moments before his hanging, gave a flawless performance reciting a poem so cheeky that half the crowd was still laughing as the trapdoor swung open. In France, a juggler turned executioner became something of a folk hero for his ability to toss apples knives and flaming torches with the same hands he used for justice. He was even invited to perform at weddings, though his availability depended on the crime rate. But not every gathering was morbid. For many townsfolk, executions were simply a part of the seasonal calendar, no more emotionally charged than Harvest Festival or the arrival of the traveling puppet show. There are records of parents bringing their children for the spectacle, only to spend the day playing games and sharing sweet buns, sometimes barely paying attention to the main event. In some places, the executioner's family would host a farewell breakfast for the condemned, attended by neighbors with a surprising amount of good cheer. Punishment, for all its horror, often brought a carnival atmosphere. After the official sentence was carried out, musicians would strike up a tune, and people would dance, or in some towns compete in foot races for the condemned's last pair of shoes. Local legends even tell of a lucky villager who caught the executioner's hat as it was blown off by a gust of wind, a prize said to bring a year's good luck and a lifetime of suspicious looks. Of course, the crowd's mood could turn. Sometimes an unpopular sentence or a botched execution would spark unrest. In such moments, the same energy that made for a festive day could transform into something dangerous, with villagers hurling insults, or in one infamous case, launching stale pastries at officials until order was restored. On the whole, though the public execution was managed like any other communal ritual, with its own rules, etiquette, and odd traditions. A particularly strange event occurred in Prague when the town was between executioners, the previous one having retired to run a bakery as one does. The city hired a traveling performer who combined acrobatics with the act itself. The resulting spectacle was so popular that the authorities had to declare a no-juggling rule for all future executions, lest things get out of hand. Yet, for all the revelry, the lesson was always clear: authority demanded respect, and the public was expected to play its part. The condemned, for their part, often became reluctant celebrities. There are preserved letters from prisoners who used their final hours to send jokes, confessions, and even baking recipes to friends and family. A strangely touching reminder that even at the edge of terror, ordinary life and humor endured. So, as you picture yourself among the crowd, bun in hand, watching a juggler balance his career prospects with a flaming torch, remember that the medieval world was never quite as simple or as grim as its reputation suggests. Justice and celebration, cruelty and carnival all swirled together on market days, leaving behind stories as memorable as any official verdict. While the noise and spectacle of public executions dominated the open air deep inside the stone walls, another kind of record was being kept, one that was quieter but no less enduring. The scribe, that unsung hero or professional gossip, sat hunched over a splintered desk quill in hand, meticulously noting every confession, accusation, and sentence delivered in the chamber above. In the age before typewriters, every detail, each plea, protest, and pitiful joke was committed to parchment preserved for the ages in ink that often outlasted the names it recorded. Medieval bureaucracy may sound dull, but these scribes were the chroniclers of their time, ensuring that even the smallest scandal would survive long after the last scream faded from the stones. The job came with its own peculiar dangers: ink-stained hands, stiff backs, and the constant risk of falling asleep in the middle of a testimony, only to wake up with the confession scrawled across your sleeve. Some scribes got creative to keep themselves alert, recording not just the facts, but the color and flavor of every day. In between somber depositions, you'd find little doodles frogs with crowns, jousting snails, stick-figure hangmen, leaping across the margins in elaborate acrobatics. One document from Flanders even features a dancing cat rendered with such care that you wonder if the artist had been hoping for a lighter posting. The importance of record-keeping went beyond mere documentation. These scribes were in their own way the gatekeepers of history, shaping how future generations would view their age. An official record could mean the difference between an unremarkable accusation and an infamous scandal. If the scribe was feeling bored or particularly poetic, he might embellish a confession, adding dialogue or flair that transformed a routine theft into a tale worth retelling at dinner tables for decades. Some even wrote their own commentary in the margins, gently mocking the officials, or providing context that a casual reader would miss centuries later. This one confessed with tears, but still asked for bread and cheese, one scribe notes underlining the daily reality of human frailty beneath all the drama. It wasn't all somber business either. On slow days, scribes sometimes organized impromptu games contests to see who could write the neatest line, or who could slip the silliest Latin pun into the court transcript without being caught. The best of these were whispered about for years afterward, turning the dry business of documentation into a secret sport. In one particularly infamous instance, a scribe drew an entire story in the margins about a mouse who stole cheese from the judge's pocket and was put on trial complete with illustrations. The tale made it into the local legend, and for years children asked after the fate of Sir Mousington whenever their parents passed the town hall. But beyond the doodles and jokes, these records served as grim reminders. In times of famine, disease, or rebellion, the pages thickened with more confessions and fewer pardons. A single year's ledger might tell the story of a village's descent into paranoia, or, in more optimistic times, a sudden wave of forgiveness as a new lord decided to clear the dungeons for spring cleaning. Occasionally, the scribes themselves became characters in the records. A bored apprentice once confessed to stealing ink and using it to paint a mustache on the town's statue of St. Crispin. The resulting punishment, a day spent copying the Psalms by candlelight, was carefully recorded, though with a suspiciously cheerful note. No lasting harm done, except to the saint's dignity. It's worth noting that in some regions the scribe was also responsible for recording the details of the town's daily life outside the chamber harvest yields: births and deaths, marriages, and even particularly memorable arguments at the market. These everyday notes provided context for the confessions and punishments above, making clear that the chamber was not an isolated place of terror, but a strange, inextricable part of the community's routine. On the lighter side, scribes were known to play favorites. There are marginal notes bemoaning the odor of certain prisoners, the dullness of some confessions he confesses but oh so boring, or the rare brilliance of an accused thief who could recite poetry in 3 languages. A scribe's opinion could color a case for generations, turning ordinary mischief into legend. And once, in an utterly unrelated turn, a particularly eccentric scribe dedicated an entire page to the most handsome cat in the village, complete with a miniature portrait and a lengthy debate over whether the cat should be awarded the title of honorary mouse catcher. It is perhaps the most wholesome moment in the town's otherwise grim judicial history. So, next time you imagine a medieval torture chamber, remember the men and women behind the ink-stained pages. Their records were the true legacy, capturing not just the pain and fear, but also the sly wit, secret games, and odd flashes of humanity that kept the chamber and the town running from one century to the next. Even if the scribe's quill grew weary, the stories of pain and punishment didn't fade. They lived on, woven into the very laws and customs of the medieval town. The chamber's horrors were justified as necessary evils, torture as deterrent, as lesson as supposed guarantee that justice, however messy, was being served. But did it work? Did the shadow of the rack or the threat of the dunking stool truly keep villagers honest? Or was the real power in what people imagined might happen if they broke the rules? Medieval rulers certainly believed in the power of spectacle. The local lord, the bishop, or the city council didn't just rely on the actual punishments to maintain order. They amplified the fear with stories, rituals, and a parade of reminders about what might be waiting for those who stepped out of line. Public trials were conducted with maximum drama, while rumors about mysterious disappearances or unearthly screams were left to swirl through tavern corners and market stalls. It's the original Scared Straight program, only with less paperwork and considerably more shouting, and the chamber was only one piece of the puzzle. Sometimes the threat of torture rather than its reality was enough to keep the peace. Local constables, perhaps feeling a little theatrical, would walk would-be troublemakers past the heavy door, offering a hint of what lay within. Confess now, they'd murmur, or you'll get better acquainted with the Iron Maiden. More often than not, the imagination did all the hard work. Still, deterrence had its limits. History is full of notorious repeat offenders, pickpockets who never learned feuding neighbors who could recite the chamber's inventory by heart, even the occasional sheep thief, so familiar with the stocks that he carved his initials into the wood for posterity. One legend tells of a scoundrel who, after his 5th stay in the town's dungeon, requested his favorite pillow and a bowl of soup from the cook, insisting, "If I'm to be punished, let it be with a full stomach." Yet, for all the horror, some towns paired harsh justice with forgiveness, holding annual festivals to clean the slate. In England, the ancient tradition of the forgiveness of debts allowed villagers to start fresh each spring. Those who had spent a time in the stocks or the pillory could join in, sometimes even presiding over the festivities. Songs were sung, debts forgiven, and if the local brewer had been generous, memories conveniently blurred. One scribe records the joyful chaos of Forgiveness Day, in surprising detail, all offenses washed away, except for the missing goat, which no one believes was ever stolen. Medieval authorities loved a good deterrent, but the people knew how to bend the rules. There are stories of towns where the mere idea of a new torture device was enough to spark months of creative gossip. When a traveling merchant arrived with a wagon load of odd metalwork, the rumor mill cranked into overdrive. Was it a new rack, a portable ducking stool, or, as one enterprising baker guessed, simply a badly designed butter churn? The object's real purpose never mattered. The fear did the work. Odd traditions grew up around these stories. In one French village, every winter, the townsfolk held a night of confessions, gathering by candlelight to share their mildest misdeeds, eating the last apple, snoring during Mass, switching the village rooster's feed with peppercorns. No torture, followed only laughter and a toast to surviving another year. Even in the shadow of pain there was room for community, and sometimes deterrence failed spectacularly. In Germany, a judge once tried to introduce a new punishment bell to be rung whenever a crime was committed. Instead, the bell became the centerpiece of an annual parade where townsfolk marched through the streets in ridiculous costumes, each trying to outdo the last with ever more outrageous confessions. The intended warning turned into a highlight of the social calendar. There's a certain genius in how medieval society walked this tightrope between terror and forgiveness, discipline and absurdity. The authorities maintained control, but the people carved out space for jokes, for ritual, and for the hope that with luck and laughter they might avoid the worst the chamber had to offer. Of course, all the threats and warnings sometimes worked a little too well. In a town in Tuscany, a new scribe accidentally copied a particularly chilling legend about the devil's tongs into the official record. Within a week, crime dropped to 0, but so did church attendance. No one wanted to risk a trip past the chamber even for a sermon. The lesson: never underestimate the power of a good, scary story, especially when the truth is just as strange. In the end, the real impact of the medieval torture chamber was less about how many bones were broken, and more about the stories that were told, the lessons learned, and the weird, wonderful ways that people found to laugh, forgive, and keep each other guessing. Despite the chamber's grim reputation and the city father's best efforts to keep its doors tightly barred, stories of miraculous escapes and unlikely survivors became a cherished part of medieval folklore. Every town seemed to have its own legend: a clever apprentice, a bold noblewoman, or a humble baker, who, through luck, cunning, or sheer stubbornness, managed to wriggle out of the chamber's grasp, sometimes quite literally. Consider the case of Lady Marjorie of Dunwich, whose tale was repeated with great gusto in local taverns. Accused of plotting to steal the bishop's favorite horse, she was hauled into the chamber and locked in the stocks. While the officials squabbled over the best way to extract a confession, Lady Marjorie used a hairpin to pick the lock, an impressive feat in itself, but made even more remarkable by her decision to pause halfway through to fix her bonnet. She strolled out the front door and disappeared into the crowd, later sending the jailer a thank you note, and according to some versions a particularly sassy limerick. But not all escapes relied on skill. Some were down to chance or a little help from friends. In the German town of Oberdorf, a baker named Jakob found himself on the wrong side of the law after being accused of shortchanging customers. While awaiting his turn on the rack, his wife, armed with nothing but a pie and a persuasive tone, managed to talk her way into the chamber, ostensibly to bring him a last meal. The guards, distracted by the delicious aroma, allowed her to linger. In the resulting confusion, Jakob slipped out under the tablecloth and was smuggled to safety in a barrel marked pickled herring. The great pie escape became a local legend and ensured that for years afterward, no one in Oberdorf trusted a barrel without checking for feet first. Occasionally, it was simple luck that saved the day. There's a record from Florence of a man who, after days in the chamber, was accidentally released when his paperwork was mixed up with that of a chicken thief scheduled for release. The error was discovered only after the wrong man was seen buying a celebratory pastry at the market and singing loudly about his freedom. The authorities, realizing their mistake, simply shrugged, perhaps grateful that the paperwork had at least reduced the prison's population by 1. Then there were those who survived the ordeal not by escaping, but by outlasting the authorities' patience. An old story tells of a suspected thief who responded to every question with an epic saga about his family's lineage, complete with invented ancestors, tragic romances, and improbable battles with wild boar. After 3 days of this, the magistrates, worn down by confusion and a chronic shortage of ink, let him go with the stern warning never to return, unless he brought a proof of his uncle's duel with a dancing bear. Some prisoners found relief in the most unlikely allies. Take the tale of Agnes, the miller's daughter, accused of bewitching the local cows. Her fate looked grim until the town's cat, already notorious for disrupting court proceedings, managed to knock over an oil lamp, plunging the chamber into chaos. In the darkness, Agnes slipped away later, turning up at her cousin's wedding with a brand-new hat and a mysterious story about midnight miracles. Jailbreaks were rare, but not unheard of. In one particularly famous event, a group of townsfolk staged a distraction by parading a goat through the main square dressed as a bishop, while the real bishop was detained in an argument about cheese taxes. During the resulting commotion, 3 prisoners made their escape, vanishing into legend and inspiring generations of local children to invent their own elaborate plans for accidental freedom. Even more miraculous were the tales of those who managed to win favor and return to society. One chronicler describes a notorious apple thief who charmed the town council with his wit, and was eventually appointed as the official festival jester, proof that, in the right circumstances, a quick tongue could be more useful than a sturdy lockpick. Of course not. Every escape was real. The chamber spawned just as many tall tales as true ones, stories polished with each retelling until it was impossible to tell fact from fiction. In the end, though these stories served a purpose, they offered hope in the face of fear, made the chamber seem a little less invincible, and perhaps, most importantly, provided excellent material for drowsy evenings around the fire. So, the next time you hear a creak in the dark, or catch a glimpse of a suspiciously lumpy pie at the village fair, remember the clever, the lucky, and the bold, the escape artists of medieval legend, whose stories lingered long after the locks rusted shut. Stepping back from the chamber's gloom and out into the thin sunlight, you might wonder what became of those who survived its ordeals, who staggered, limped, or laughed their way back to ordinary life. For many, the end of their time in the chamber was not an ending at all, but the start of a long, complicated return to the world outside. The journey from dungeon to daylight was rarely straightforward, and medieval society had its own way of folding these former prisoners back into the patchwork of daily life. Physically, some bore the marks of their ordeal forever. A twisted limb, a permanent limp, a scar in the shape of the town's branding iron, or occasionally a lopsided ear from a botched haircut administered by a nervous jailer. Yet, just as often, the psychological shadows ran deeper. In some towns, returning prisoners were met with suspicion or whispered jokes. In others, they were welcomed back with awkward affection, as if survival itself was proof of resilience. In rare cases, the return was cause for celebration, especially if the former inmate had become a local folk hero, or had somehow gained notoriety as the only person to outlast the town scribe's endless questions. Medieval communities, pragmatic as ever, devised their own rituals for reintegration. In parts of France and Italy, families would throw a small party half relief, half reintroduction, complete with sweet cakes and sometimes speeches about forgiveness. The baker, always ready to turn a profit, invented get-well-soon loaves for these occasions shaped like heart's keys, or the mayor's rather unfortunate nose. In England, parish priests offered special prayers for those returned from the shadows, while neighbors might quietly leave gifts at the doorstep, bread, cheese, or a new pair of shoes, all silent tokens that life should move forward. But not all returns were so smooth. Chroniclers tell of men and women who left the chamber only to find that superstition clung as tightly as any manacle. A branded thief might be barred from the market, while a woman accused of witchcraft could find herself subject to every ill wind, blamed for everything from spoiled ale to missing chickens. For these souls, adaptation meant inventiveness, taking up new trades, moving to distant villages, or in a few cases transforming their experience into public service. Some became local advisors on justice, warning the next generation to steer clear of the town's grumpiest magistrate, and to avoid confessing to anything unless the scribe ran out of ink. Yet human nature being what it is, humor flourished alongside hardship. The infamous pie incident was retold as a cautionary tale at weddings. The story of the escaped chicken thief became a favorite bedtime fable, and those who had spent time in the chamber sometimes started an informal club. They'd meet once a month at the back table of the tavern, swapping jokes and quietly rating the food, not as bland as the jail's gruel, one might say, but lacking a certain iron tang. Remarkably, the chamber's influence even touched local cuisine. Some towns created liberty cakes, sweet buns filled with nuts, and candied fruit handed out to those freed from punishment. One clever baker started selling freedom pies that came with a tiny edible key inside. These little culinary traditions provided a way for people to turn suffering into celebration, fear into flavor. and the chamber's legacy into something more palatable. Still, the memories lingered. A former prisoner might flinch at the sound of rattling keys or avoid the market square on days when justice was dispensed. But over time, most found ways to adapt joke and build new lives. In the grand cycle of medieval life, everyone eventually became a storyteller, weaving their own brush with the chamber into the rich, rambling history of the town. On rare occasions, an especially charismatic survivor became something of a local celebrity, even sought out for advice in matters of luck and justice. The wise old woman with the crooked finger, the cheerful thief who made the best apple tarts, the reformed poacher who taught children how to spot snares in the forest. Each became a thread in the tapestry, reminders that hardship, like history itself, could be endured, outgrown, and, if you were lucky, laughed about over a mug of ale. As the sunlight fades and evening creeps back in, you realize that the chamber's shadow, though long, never quite swallowed the lives it touched. People emerged, changed, yes, but also determined to reclaim their place one cake joke or whispered story at a time. Now, with the chamber behind you and the stories still echoing in your mind, it's time to reflect on how the world changed and what became of those rooms of shadow and iron. For centuries, the very word torture conjured images of cold dungeons, echoing screams, and stern-faced magistrates wielding too much power. But as time rolled forward and ideas of justice and mercy evolved, even the most notorious torture chambers lost their edge, transforming from tools of terror into oddities, museum curiosities, cautionary tales, and, oddly enough, popular backdrops for the occasional tourist's selfie. What changed slowly? A new understanding of justice took root across Europe. As the Renaissance blossomed and Enlightenment thinkers began to question the morality and effectiveness of torture, those dark rooms lost their official power. Laws shifted. Monarchs and councils, pressured by philosophers and public sentiment, gradually abolished legal torture, sometimes out of enlightenment, sometimes just to keep up with their more fashionable neighbors. Dungeons were sealed, racks dismantled, and iron maidens tucked away behind velvet ropes. Yet the old devices lingered. Some, like the infamous rack or the pair of anguish, became display pieces in city halls and town museums. Guides led curious visitors through cobwebbed corridors, spinning tales of dread and escape. Children dared each other to touch the cold iron spikes, while local artists painted lurid scenes of medieval justice that grew more colorful and less accurate with every passing year. In a strange twist, the very tools once designed to terrify became props for storytelling as vital to the town's identity as its church spire or its most famous bakery. Meanwhile, the stories themselves changed tone. The confessions wrung out by fear faded from memory, replaced by legends of miraculous escapes, clever tricks, and the unstoppable resilience of ordinary people. The pie escape, the singing thief, the cat who ruined a magistrate's paperwork, all became part of the folklore, more likely to be shared over drinks or written up in the local paper than whispered in terror. Every town with a chamber became a little bit proud of its bizarre history, finding comfort in the distance between then and now. Tourists, always eager for a taste of the strange, flocked to see the relics. Some snapped photos pretending to be locked in stocks, while others posed dramatically in front of iron maidens, their faces twisted into comic expressions of terror. School groups made annual visits, competing to see who could invent the silliest confession or sketch the oddest doodle in their notebooks. In an age of camera phones and social media, even the darkest corners of history found new light transformed from terror into novelty, from pain into spectacle. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is in the questions these places still raise. What does it mean to seek justice? How do fear and rumor shape communities? And how does humor, however dark, help people survive? Even the strangest hardships, the chamber's afterlife, reminds us that history is never quite as tidy as we wish. Pain and laughter, horror and healing, punishment and forgiveness, they're all bound together, echoing down the centuries in ways both sobering and absurd. So, as you leave this strange journey behind and settle into the soft warmth of your own bed, take a moment to appreciate the quiet. Listen to the gentle hum of the fan, the distant city sounds, or maybe just the hush of night. Those chambers may be silent now, but their stories remain etched into old stone and fresh imagination alike. Thank you for staying with me through the darkest and silliest corners of medieval history. I hope these tales remind you not just of what people endured, but of the strange resilience, humor, and hope that made it all survivable. May your dreams be free of iron maidens and unruly town cats, and may your nights be long, gentle, and blessedly uneventful. The echoes of old stories drift through your mind as you lie back, the soft hush of modern comforts wrapping around you, far removed from the hard benches and heavy chains of centuries past. Outside, perhaps there's a distant rumble of traffic or the steady whir of your fan. But for a moment you can almost imagine a world lit only by torchlight and worry, where every sound carried a tale and every shadow held a lesson. You might remember, just before sleep claims you, the faces of those who moved through the chamber, the clever escape artists, the nervous scribes doodling in the margins, the pie-baking wives, and the town cats disrupting solemn justice. You might recall with a wry smile how laughter and fear walked hand in hand, and how even the darkest places could be reshaped by a joke, a loaf of bread, or a story retold. History, after all, isn't only about suffering or survival. It's about resilience, the quiet, persistent kind that finds its way through cracks in stone, that clings to hope in the form of a doodle or a well-timed pun. These stories, grim and absurd, now belong to the ages, softened and reshaped by the centuries. No longer instruments of terror, but reminders of how people endured, adapted, and sometimes found meaning where none was intended. As the last flickers of the chamber fade, let the lessons linger, that courage can take the form of laughter, that communities heal with rituals both strange and sweet, and that the best antidote to darkness is the gentle light of understanding shared and retold night after night until fear loses its edge. May your sleep tonight be deep and untroubled, and your dreams full of unlikely escapes, forgiving festivals, and midnight cakes. Thank you for listening, for imagining, and for sharing this journey into the softest shadows of the past. Good night,